Okay, well, for this video segment, I'm going to be talking with Rodney Hughes. And Rodney right now is a doctoral student in the higher ed program. He also has a background in economics. Both his undergraduate and master's degree from Penn State were in economics. And he served as a student member on Penn State's Board of Trustees. And I thought it'd make sense to talk with Rodney about decision support, as the assignment for this week is really highly related to that topic of decision support. And in the assignment, you were asked to make decisions, and you were given some information, not enough to know for certainty what the right answer was, but enough information that would advance your thinking about the decision you were making. And if you're providing decision support, you have to make these sort of decisions. What information do I want to include when I'm providing information to someone making a decision? And part of the the work for this unit was talking about what information do you want to include. You want to include opportunity costs, you want to ignore sunk costs, and you often want to focus on marginal costs, right? And so you have to figure out what information to include, and then you want to try to structure that information in a way that makes the decision making easier, right? That's the idea, is you can't perhaps make the decision, but you can set up the information in a way that makes it easy for someone else to be making the decision. And so, Rodney, let's turn to you now. In your time on the board, you were required to vote on a lot of decisions. And so you gained some information on making decisions and being supported with information while making the decisions. So what sort of insights can you share from those experiences?
Well, thank you, John. I would like to make 3 points, especially related to the way I've thought about decisions, related to a lot of these concepts, given that my original training was in economics, so I kind of tried to bring this framework to these decisions that I saw. But I'll make 3 points. One, about the advantages and disadvantages of receiving information that's processed in the way John described. Second, the way I think it's most advantageous to receive that information, to make the most of the advantages and try to limit the disadvantages. And finally, something that we've heard come up, and something that's, I think, at least a little bit unavoidable, problematic about how agendas are structured and how at least a governing board would make decisions. But first, to think about the advantages and disadvantages of information processing. When you think about a governing board for an institution, it's a volunteer role, and a lot of the trustees at Penn State and at similar institutions have full-time jobs, so they don't have the amount of time to dedicate to any particular decision to comprehensively think about all of the costs, all of the benefits, and all of the competing options. So it's very helpful to have either an institutional research staff or an institutional administration filter a lot of this information. So think about what kinds of decisions are consistent with an overall strategic plan for an institution, what's helpful at the unit level or at the college or department level, and think about decisions that are worthy of being advanced for consideration at the level of a governing board. So for the purposes of kind of filtering decisions that can possibly be made or useful strategies, having this kind of support from an institutional research office and administration is very, very helpful and makes the experience a lot more efficient for the people that are going to be making these decisions. The downside of that is that you don't necessarily see or get to participate in this information filtering. So you don't know necessarily if the information that you're seeing is reliable, or if it's kind of carried out on the same basis with which you would do that if you were the one kind of participating at earlier stages of the process. So the advantage is efficiency, and the disadvantage is that kind of second-hand stage at which you receive this information. So how to make the most of the efficiency, but also kind of get this ability to consider these decisions as thoroughly as you can and be as much of a participant as you can. That brings me to the second point, which is what's the best way to present this kind of processed information. I think in terms of decisions that a governing board would make, possibly building a new program, a center, so much of what's important is projections for the future. So if we think about something like a marginal cost, you could have a good idea what upfront costs are going to be like, you have a good idea what upfront revenues are going to be like, but you might not know down the road, in terms of the viability of a particular decision, what anticipated revenues and costs for the future look like. So projections are very important. and to make projections you might receive as useful as possible. It would be helpful to know what kinds of methods or what kinds of information are used to arrive at these projections. So if we are voting whether or not to approve a building that's going to be used by a department, we might want to know things like, if we add this building, how many students will this program want to educate in the future? What size faculty will it want to maintain? Will this be able to attract students and faculty we might not have been able to before? And does this open up any kinds of opportunities for external funding? So something like that when thinking about costs and benefits in the future, to know, one, these are the figures we've arrived at, and two, here's how we've done it. It's kind of efficient for someone to receive, but you can also see to a great degree of detail what's underlying that information. But that brings me to my final point. Even if you get that kind of quality information, the decision is still presented to you in a yes-no kind of manner, which I think is just a limitation of the way that an agenda would work for a governing board or for decision-making at that kind of level. Because you can do your best to assess the suitability of that particular decision and whether or not an investment of that resources toward that end will help the institution to achieve its mission, and if its economic or financial benefits will outweigh its costs. But you don't know from among all of the options available to the institution if that decision is the best use of resources. There's a distinction between the yes-no kind of decision, is this a positive or is this a profitable decision or not, versus is making this decision the best way we can use the resources that we have. And coming to that kind of conclusion, that kind of this is the best decision we can make, brings you back to that first step of filtering that information, thinking about all of the options that are available, which really does require an intense investment of time. So it's up to the institutional research staff, up to the administration, to carry out those steps and filter that information, and still present the decisions that have been made at the earliest stages in a usable way to the governing board to kind of capture the best balance between efficiency and the thoroughness and the due diligence that's expected of a governing board.
All right, well, let me pick up on that idea of the yes-no decision, and just, it reminds me of a story that I often like to tell to illustrate some of the key points related a little bit to what Rodney was talking about, a little bit that was in this unit. And in 1999, my wife and I were buying a car. It was the first time I was purchasing a car, the first time my wife and I were purchasing a car together. And we had the key decision: do we want to buy side airbags? And so they said, I think it was going to be an extra $500. I forget the amount. And so we were forced, my wife and I both being very rational people, both trained in economics, we were forced to say, do cost-benefit analysis and decide whether the cost, $500, was worth the benefit, which was a slight increase in the likelihood that I would not be killed in a car accident. Right? And so you can think about that, and you can think about there's sort of two morals to this story. The first is I'm forced to make a yes-no decision. Right there, I'm forced to compare these things. And the second moral of the story is that the decision forces me to put a dollar sign on something that has no dollar sign on it. Right? When I do the benefits and costs, right, it's very easy for me to estimate the cost with great precision, $500, and now I'm forced to say whether a slight increase in the likelihood that I won't be killed in a car accident is worth $500 to me or not, right? And you can think in the college setting all sorts of times you are forced in the decision to say how much you value student learning, right? Or how much you value students' ability to engage in certain extracurricular activities, right? And there's no dollar sign to it, but the decision-making process sort of forces that onto it. And the goal is to try to make that, because that's so hard, if you can put in that decision support, it makes it a lot easier to try to work through those really, really hard decisions. And I'll end by simply noting that we did not buy the side airbags, but we did buy the enhanced stereo options. So I can only hope that college and university policymakers are much sounder in their decision-making process than I am.